world to vibrant life in this wonderful novel. And I'm really excited. I can't wait for it tonight. And then Alice is joined by Northshire's longtime friend, Chris Castellani. I had the great pleasure of hosting Chris for the hardcover release of Leading Men, which is also a Northshire staff favorite, back in 2019 at our Booktopia Festival. And it's a great pairing. I mean, this is just a perfect event, I think, because his Leading Men, it's about Tennessee Williams. So y'all are in for a real literary treat tonight. And please welcome Chris Castellani and Alice Miller.
Hi, I'm Alice Miller, obviously, I guess. Thank you so much to you both and at Northshire for hosting this. It's really, really cool. And it's very lovely to be virtually here. In Berlin, it's 11 p.m. So I think usually I would be in bed, and now I'm here. I mean, this is superb. So welcome to Berlin. And it's so lovely to be in conversation with Chris. Thank you so much. I have not met Chris before, but I have read his wonderful book, and it is it's a beautiful, smart, elegant novel, and I highly recommend it. He'll talk a little bit about it in a bit. And yeah, so I'm just going to read a tiny bit from this, which is my book. It's yeah, there we go. Hold them up. This is it's a book about wartime and about ghosts and about secret societies and famous poets, but it's really a book about Georgie, a brilliant woman who wants to find proof of the afterlife. I'm just going to read a really short piece in the dark, apparently, because I haven't really necessarily planned this particularly well. This is a short piece from the war hospital where Georgie works. This is First World War London, and she's got this job in a war hospital because she wants to live on her own in London. So she's kind of excited about it. She thinks it's kind of great that she has managed to do this. But she's starting to realize that actually working in a war hospital is maybe not quite so easy as one might imagine. It's just a little hospital for officers. And this little passage features a character called Pike, who is a main character in the novel. Okay, it's very weird to not have anybody breathing or anything. I mean, it's obviously very weird to be just sitting at home and reading from your book. But it's kind of, I never thought that I would just miss breathing and coughing. And so if anyone wants to, unmute or make breathing or coughing noises, just please feel free. Okay, here we go. After the visitors had left and the night shift commenced, Georgie started to dig her nails into her palms to keep herself awake. The ward was silent, and she was the only person on duty, armed with a bell which could summon the matron who was sleeping upstairs. Georgie eyed the clock at the back of the room. One of the gold hands twitched. Standing for such a long time, they were forbidden to sit, meant already Georgie's back and feet ached with a cool pulsing pain. She avoided looking towards the bed of Major Hammond, who seemed to her to be near death. A part of her thought that if she didn't look too closely at death, perhaps she might escape it. Will you sit a while? It was Second Lieutenant Pike again, with his ruined feet sticking out the end of the bed. He gestured to a chair. I'm not allowed. A pity. Unlike the other men, many of whom slept all day and all night, Pike did not seem to need to rest. She hadn't yet seen him close his eyes. She was debating about whether or not she should sit down anyway, given how tired she was, when there was a scream across the room. Then another. Strained, sharp screams. It was as though a small, howling creature were trying to burrow its way out of a body. Georgie hurried over. It was the same young officer from the first day, the blonde one with the scaly face, whose name Georgie had already forgotten. He began to arch his back and fall back down on the bed, arch, and fall. She stood by him a moment before reaching for his wrists, but he shook her off, arms flailing in the air, scratching at nothing. "You're all right," Georgie said, reaching for him again. He grabbed at a handful of her hair and pulled, yanking several strands out of the follicle. "Mary," he yelled, his breath hot. He had streams of snot and tears running down his face, and his cheeks were bright orange from the gas. The bald patches of his scalp were wet. "I'm not Mary," she said. I'm the nurse." He reached his arms up to her neck as if he wanted to strangle her, and she stepped out of the way. "I didn't bring your gospel, Mary," the man said, his eyes wide. "I left it in your stupid head." He lunged up and caught her wrist. Georgie leaned down and with her other hand slapped the boy's face across the cheek. The boy dropped her hand and whimpered. He thumped his own windpipe with his fist, making a deep thud like wood dropping on bone. She rushed across the room to ring the bell, and after a few minutes, footsteps could be heard coming down the stairs. Mrs. Thwaite, with a coat over her dressing gown, arrived in the room as the boy's eyes flew open again, and the matron rushed over to him immediately, speaking softly and stroking his hair, moving closer until she was holding his head in her arms like a lover. "You're safe here, you're in London, everything is all right, I've got you, you're safe, I promise." After some time, the boy fell limp, his eyes half closed, his arms resting loosely on either side of his body. Mrs. Thwaite said nothing to Georgie. She disentangled herself from the boy, looked around the ward once, left the room again, and could be heard going slowly upstairs. Other officers were stirring, one was signalling for water. Georgie's uniform was wet with sweat. She felt as if she were waiting for someone else to wake, some other blurry horror to float into the room. "Please take a seat, just sit down." From his bed, Second Lieutenant Pike spoke softly. The red-brown tufts of his hair were curved up like the horns of an owl. His eyes were unblinking and calm in the light from the weak electric lamp. It seemed to her at that moment as if he were offering her something of great worth, something she should remember. She walked to the chair beside his bed and sank down into it. Thanks very much.
I'm unmuting so that I can clap. Thank you so much, Alice, for that reading. I had the great pleasure of reading More Miracle Than Bird last year when it was in galley form, and I fell in love with it immediately, and I fell in love with Alice's sentences and with the full humanity of the character, and also because I'm a literature nerd, just seeing Yeats come alive and seeing his his circles come alive and the world of the occult and the hospital, all of it just sort of pressed all of my buttons from all my English classes throughout the years. So it's such a wonderful book, and we're all really here today, and thank you all for being here. And we're all really here today in celebration of the publication of this book, which really just came out. Actually, when is the exact pub date, or when was the exact pub date?
It was 2nd of June. So it was sort of a while ago, but there were some far more important things going on at that point. So we're this is the first kind of event that we've had, which is exactly right.
Yes, this is the launch. Yes, it's been in the world, thankfully, for a month, but this is the official launch. And so I just also want to congratulate you, Alice, on this event, and I'm so happy to be a part of it. I'm guessing I was paired both to read the book ahead of time and to be here because my novel, which Alice mentioned, is called Leading Men, and it also features a literary figure as one of the characters in the book. And like Alice's book, the literary figure is not really the star of the book. It's really the love interest of the literary figure who is the star of the book. And for me, that person is a a man named Frank Merlo, who was a working class Italian-American guy who was Tennessee Williams' partner for 15 years in between the late 40s and 1963, when Frank died at 40 of lung cancer. And during those 15 years that Frank and Tennessee were together are the most fruitful years of Williams's career. So all the plays that you know, Streetcar Named Desire, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Suddenly Last Summer, all those great plays were written during the time of their relationship. And then once Frank passed, there was never another truly successful play. So I wrote the book as a way of kind of inhabiting Frank and telling his story, much the way that Alice inhabited Georgie. I feel like I can call her Georgie, right? I mean, and I feel close to her, and tell her story. So I'm also going to read just the first page and a bit, and it's set in these sections are set in Italy in 1953, and it's narrated, as I said, by Frank Merlo, who is Truman Capote's partner. I'm sorry, Tennessee Williams' partner, but we're starting at Truman Capote's house. Truman was throwing a party in Portofino, and Frank wanted to go. The invitation came in mid-July, slipped between parentheses in the long gossipy paragraphs of his letter to Ten, as if daring him to accept it. Frank read the letter in Ten's absence. He'd been stuck for weeks in their stuffy fourth-floor apartment on Via Firenze, waiting for him to get back from Spain, while on the loud streets below, the real Romans escaped for the mountains. He replied to Truman with a brief telegram, and then he called the finest hotel in town, the Splendido, to book a room. He auditioned various linen jackets and swim trunks and hats in the mirror above the dresser, mended 2 pairs of Ten's socks, and walked their silks down to the cleaners. When Ten returned home to find their bags lined up in the hall, packed for another trip, he didn't protest. He was sweet on Frank again after 3 weeks apart. A drive in the Jag, up the coast of Liguria, far from the melting heart of the Centro, could only make things sweeter. Truman had rented an apartment a few steps from the harbor, above the Delfino restaurant, which Frank and Ten passed on their way up the hill to the Splendido. Ten paid the boat guy to carry their luggage, and when the hill got too steep, Frank grabbed the heavy case with the typewriter. He didn't like it when another guy did work for him that he could do himself, a guy who would have been him if he'd never left Jersey. The Splendido Hotel was first a monastery, the boat guy told him, and now look at it, the place Clark Gable drinks his brandy to a view. Ten went straight to the desk as usual, and Frank arranged their dress shirts on hangers and brought their shoes down for shining and stole another hour for a nap. He'd never felt so tired in the middle of the afternoon, and he chalked it up to being 30. But it's possible no doctor was ever able to tell him for sure, one way or another, that the trouble had already started in his lungs. When he woke, Ten offered him a pill. Ten had as many pills as Italy had houses on the water. But Frank wasn't taking pills, not then. Instead, he smoked another cigarette and paid the boat guy to drive him over the mountain to Paragi Beach, where he swam to find his strength and clear his head. They didn't like Truman much, but Frank didn't hate him the way Ten did, or maybe Ten didn't hate Truman. It was hard to know for sure with Ten. It was a job in itself, keeping track of who he was angry with and who was jealous of him, whose parties he was looking forward to, and whose parties he was looking forward to, and whose they'd have to make up some excuse to get out of. Frank's official job was as Ten's secretary, but even his secretary didn't have a reason for being in Portofino other than to stop by Truman's party, and he didn't know when they'd be leaving. There wasn't much Frank knew in the summer of 1953, least of all, how long he and Ten might last. And I'll stop there. Thank you. One of the things that struck me, even just reading that passage, Alice, is you know, Frank's anxiety about being, he had anxiety in a way about being Ten's secretary, and some of those same kind of dynamics, of course, play out in the relationship between Georgie and Yates. But besides that, we can talk more about the characters later. But besides that, before that, I wanted to just ask you, just to take us through, like, how did this book come together? I mean, everybody asked me, they assume I was this huge Tennessee Williams fan, and that I wanted to write about Tennessee Williams, and this was my way to write about him. But that was not the case for me, and I'm curious about your relationship to Yates and how really you came to this story.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for that lovely reading. Yeah. And we must talk more about these characters and that relationship, because I think it's really interesting, and also really interesting in terms of the kind of the heterosexual relationship and the homosexual relationship and what the gender dynamics are, is quite fascinating. But yeah, the book itself, I was a Yeats fan, but I never would have wanted to write about Yeats. That to me seems very strange and also totally audacious. I would never, the fact that I've even done it is still kind of a bit, well, anyway, but I really just fell in love with Georgie. I guess I've always been very interested, or perhaps obsessed, with this whole thing about what happens when we die, that small question that may have occurred to you now and again, and the fact that we really just have no idea. I suppose that if we're religious or if we're atheists, then we sort of might know, but I have no idea. And I loved kind of her bravery in that she decided that she was pretty sure that something must be there, and then she just kind of went out to go and find it. And she found a kind of a strange kind of answer to that question, which is totally unexpected and is not the answer that she would have wanted, I don't think. But yes, I think for me it was much more about her and about her story, which I think is a really fascinating one. And Yates is a part of it, which is nice, but he's not, for me, he's not the most exciting part.
Yeah, exactly. I obviously felt that reading the book. It's great that he's there and all, but it's not really, that's not really about him, So how did you, I know she's not an unknown figure, but how did you first come across her? And, or like what you said, like you're interested about, what happens after death, but I imagine that didn't come first, and then you looked for a character who would be an interesting character to write about. Like how did it come together that you wrote about her? And where did you first meet her, quote unquote?
Yeah, I'm not even really sure where I first met her. I knew that she existed, but I wasn't terribly interested. I didn't think much of it. And then I must have read, I think that James Longbach, I think there was a book, and he talks about her in this very enigmatic way, and I started to get really interested. And then this Canadian academic, Anne Settlemyer, has written like a very thorough biography, and that's kind of, is the book of, she becomes George Yates is the name that people know her by, right? So the sort of the book of George Yates. So I was sort of carried it around with me and filled it with Post-it notes. And what about you with Frank? How did you come across Frank?
It's funny. I vividly remember the moment because I was. It was actually in the late '90s. It was quite a while ago, and long before I started like really writing the book in earnest. I was in a used bookstore in Delaware visiting my mom, and because I'm super cool, it was a Friday night, and I was in this used bookstore browsing because that's what I did, and I came upon this memoir, this very dishy, like tell-all memoir of Tennessee Williams, and I was a fan of his, but like you said about Yates, I wasn't like eating, sleeping, and breathing Tennessee Williams or anything, but I was compelled for whatever reason by this very dishy memoir. So I just started, it was called Tennessee Cry of the Heart by Dotson Rader. And I think because I'm a bit of a dramatic person, I was attracted to this very melodramatic title, you know. And there's a photo of Tennessee Williams on the cover, like shirtless and sort of staring at the sky, and I was like, oh, that looks like an interesting book. Anyway, so I was sort of just leafing through the book, and I came immediately upon this scene where the writer of the book was describing this guy named Frank Merlo, who I'd never heard of, who was a guy very much like me, a working class Italian-American gay guy from Jersey, and I'm in Delaware, which is right there. And I'm learning in this book that Frank was I learned all the things I told you before, that Frank was his partner for all these years, and during that time they, you know, it was Williams's most fruitful time of his career. But the scene that I came upon was a scene of Frank dying of lung cancer in this hospital in New York in 1963, and waiting for Tennessee Williams to visit him one last time. And Williams was not coming because they were estranged, and there was a lot of tension between them, and all of this, and all of Williams's friends were sort of outraged that he wasn't coming to visit him. And I was so moved and, you know, upset by what happened to this guy, and that I immediately knew that I wanted to write about him in some way. But I thought, I'm not a biographer, so I can't write about him. I didn't even know you could put real people in fiction, you know? So it sort of didn't occur to me until a few years later, when I started to see books come out that had, you know, real people as novels that had real people as characters, that I thought, oh, you know, I can do this, you know. But I'll maybe talk later about why it took 20 years. But I wonder, for you, like, did you have any anxiety at all about writing about a real person in a novel, and how did you deal with that anxiety, if you had it?
Yes, the answer is absolutely yes, of course. I mean, yes, and I think, I mean, Georgie would not have liked this book. I still call her Georgie, even though most people call her George, just because this is the sort of earlier part of her life when she's known as Georgie, and so that's how kind of I know her. She would not have liked this book, but she would not have liked her biography either. She very much thought that wives and children should be kind of kept out of the story of the great poet, and I mean, she spent 29 years after Yeats died kind of protecting his legacy, and all these academics would come. She called it her American season. All of the American academics would come over the Atlantic to research Yeats. She was quite scathing about a lot of them, actually. But she was very careful about. I mean, he was very lucky to have this woman for, you know, basically 30 years, controlling his legacy and making sure that he got a lot of attention, and that he got the right kind of attention, and all of that. But yeah, so I think I had anxiety about writing about her, but also she's kind of evasive. She strategically tells people different stories, so that you have all these different versions of the same event, because she doesn't really want you to know what happened. So she's quite fascinating in that way. Yeats is a really difficult person to write about, because he was really quite nuts. I mean, I love Yeats. I love Yeats's work so much, and I have for a very long time. But he's such a strange combination of, I mean, he's very wise. His poems are actually extremely wise, and he's also very credible. So at the time that this book is set, Yeats, he hears about this lawyer out in the seaside, and the lawyer says he has this machine that can speak to ghosts. And Yeats is like, oh, that sounds great. And so he goes out to the seaside to see this machine twice, and he's totally convinced by it. The lawyer wants money, so he's kind of like, well, we should probably give this lawyer some money, you know, because this is fantastic. And he says, you know, even the elixir of life seems possible. You know, I mean, he believes in immortality for a few weeks because of this strange machine that he just thinks that it's brilliant. And I mean, Georgie is a bit scathing about this aspect of his kind of personality. But I mean, the English poet W.H. Auden, when he writes his famous poem after Yeats dies, he says about Yeats, you know, you were silly like us, your gift survived it all. But it's a weird line, because he's not silly like us. I mean, we don't all believe in, you know, machines that are speaking to ghosts. He's silly in a very particular, very interesting way. So they were hard to write about, I think. And it took me 6 years to write this book. And but you know, you just have to inhabit the characters. And I mean, it's my Yeats, obviously, and everyone has their own. And I hopefully, you know, it's a joy to have that multiplicity. Yeah, that's
yeah, it's an interpretation, as you said, it's an interpretation of her and of him and of really all the characters in the book, and it's an act of imagination. And one thing that that makes me so happy, and I know I'm sure this has already happened to you, and if not, it will happen very soon, is that people will say, "Oh, I read your book, or I read about your book, and it prompted me to go back, to go and find out everything I want, you know, everything about Frank and everything about Tennessee, and to rewatch Cat on a Hot Tin Roof or whatever, you know." And I feel like that's the great like joy about books like ours, you know, not to say my book is a joy, but you know what I mean. I think that
book is a joy. Yeah.
that it kind of like has these two lives. Like you like, you know, I read your book, and that was one of my immediate impulses was not just to read Yeats's work, but to sort of get into the real world, if there's even such a thing, of the book that you wrote, you know, and to go back and to check it out, and then to form my own interpretation, you know, based on the lens that you took, and then the lens that other, you know, biographers or scholars have taken. What was the research like for this? I know there's this great book, which, as you said, was almost like a Bible for you. Did you do anything else to kind of, you know, to orient yourself in that world?
Yeah. I mean, there is a lot of research. I'm sure you also did a huge amount of research. I mean, I think that, and I agree with you. I want to go back to what you said as well, because I think that these books, I mean, they're also very open, I think, in terms of how you read the sort of version of the history, and you can go back to the history, and I think they sort of encourage that sort of dialogue and argument with the actual events. And I mean, it's funny that we also both have, I mean, we have the you know, the famous writer and the famous writer's partner, and then we also have this completely fictional character who I think came along afterwards and sort of in a way, I think, sort of waltzed into the book. I mean, for me, I was quite surprised that this soldier came into the book, and he makes perfect sense. He's crucial. And you have Anya, this woman, she's also this character as well. It's quite interesting that has happened. But, I mean, I guess it's sort of more
my next question for you was, that I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. It's always hard to keep on saying about this whole collision of fact and fiction, because some readers really freak out about that. You know, they'll be like, wait, you know, you have this fictional character in the book with these real people. Why are you doing that? You know, it makes their brains hurt. And some people love it, you know, some people like, that's sort of what I loved about it. And other people, it frustrates them because they want it either all to be true or all to be made up and whatever. So like, why? I mean, Pike is so compelling, and I sensed you falling in love with him as much as her, and as a character. And so I'm curious about, again, that decision to include a fictional, which I don't know if was clear from the beginning of our conversation, that the Pike character is fictional. So what was your goal for that, and how did that happen?
Yeah, I think it happened. I mean, you were asking about the research. I mean, I did a ton of research, and I think the funny thing also about researching World War I is that, of course, you end up reading a lot about the trenches, you know, because that's what, I mean, you know, there's that film 1917 that just came out recently, you know, people really want to hear about the trenches. And there's, you know, there are a lot of first-person accounts from soldiers, and there are far fewer accounts from, you know, nurses or just people every day drinking their coffee during the First World War or whatever, you know, the social history element. So I sort of thought there was a kind of inevitability about it afterwards, that I ended up having this soldier in the narrative, because I had read so much about the trenches and about the soldiers, and then here was this man who had been there and would go back. I mean, I think that the table needed a third leg in a sense. I would love to say that I was in complete control of the entire process and I planned it all from the very beginning, but I think there is kind of an element of chaos. And yeah, so I think he came out of reading a lot about soldiers, and then suddenly, I mean, of course, she was working in a war hospital, and yeah, it made sense. But I mean, was that similar for you with Anna, or was it different?
It was, for me, yeah, I have a character in the novel who really it's really half her story as well. And she's completely fictional. And although she's inspired by a nameless person in a letter that Truman Capote wrote during that same month when they go to his party in Portofino, he mentions offhand, I sort of had an aha moment when I was reading through Truman Capote's letters as part of my research, and he said, the big scandal, I'm paraphrasing, but he said the big scandal in Portofino this summer, or one of the big scandals, is that there's a Swedish woman here, there's a Swedish mother and daughter in town, and they're both sleeping with the same Italian fisherman. And I thought immediately, I had a sort of the same moment, same feeling that I had when I first read about Frank, where I was like, I want to hang out with them. Like, I want to see what they're up to, I'm curious about them. And so I extrapolated that and made the daughter, I put the daughter at that party that Truman that Tennessee and Frank attend. And she sort of, it sounds like same thing with Pike, she sort of just took over a little bit, and she took over my imagination. And then my first instinct was to say, well, this other character, she needs to belong in some way to Tennessee Williams because he's the great playwright. She's an actress. I made her an actress, and I thought, oh, he'll take her under his wing, and she'll become one of his great actresses. And then I realized, I love this idea of the third leg in the novel, because I realized actually that she really belonged to Frank in the story, and I didn't understand Frank. And this is going to be my question for you. I didn't really understand Frank fully until I saw him through her eyes, and because I had seen him so much as Tennessee Williams' partner, and that's kind of how I imagined him. And the act of writing another character who had her own point of view and who saw him allowed me to see him in a way that I had never seen him before. So in a way, this is why it's so weird to be a writer, that like the only way I could understand my real character that I've made into a fictional character was to create a fictional character to hang out with him and to tell me about him, right? So this is like the weird like life of the writer, where it's all kind of in there.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think the kind of the different lens, and I think also there's an artificial sense when you have a historical character that you're making them into a fictional character. There's kind of like a constant cross-referencing that you're doing, and a kind of anxiety that you feel about it, and then to have a completely fictional character, I mean, it's like inventing a god. They can do anything. You can make them go anywhere. You don't have to say, oh no, she wasn't there in June 1914, so it's impossible. You can kind of, it's magical. It's ridiculous.
Exactly, but it's so exciting in a way, right? That actually leads to another question I had for you, which is, like some writers who write in this genre are very, and it is a genre, right? This genre of real people in fiction, it is sort of its own thing at this point. And some writers are very, or more liberal, for lack of a better word, about the liberties that they're taking with, oh, well, they couldn't have been there at this time, or they're really sticking to, even though they're making some stuff up, they're not making up anything that couldn't have really happened. And some writers are very, like, don't care about that. They're like, nope, I'm going to put them in Morocco in 1915, even though there's no evidence that they were there. And others really stick to the facts. And so I'm curious about your choices and like, is everything what was your thought process with sort of relationship between the real and the made up, about the real people, not about Pike, but about the real people in the book?
Yeah, I did try to be very careful about the real people. I feel that I was very haunted for a long time about like Hilary Mantel, who, I mean, herself also makes up characters, but of course she's a genius. She does this all so well and so carefully. And she, you know, she said at one point, I mean, about how carefully she had done everything. And then someone said, well, you know, what about Shakespeare? I mean, Shakespeare made so much stuff up. And she was like, yes, but I am not Shakespeare. And I was like, oh my God, I mean, I'm not even Hilary Mantel. So this is serious. So I tried to be very careful. Yeah, and then you have these made up characters. So obviously, I mean, there are characters that are based on real characters that have kind of elements of both, and I've changed the names in those cases. But yes, like Yeats and Georgie and Ezra Pound and Dorothy Shakespeare, you know, these real characters, I tried to be true to the sources. I think you did too, right? Is that?
Yeah, I think the same. And I think though, and I was very, like, as I'm sure you did, like double and triple checking the dates and everything to make sure that that the real characters were where they should have been. And I also was haunted by by these phantom Tennessee Williams scholars who would, you know, read my book and be like, they weren't there, you know, like, how dare you, you know? And so I was like, and my publisher actually had like hired a Tennessee Williams scholar to like read the book and to like fact check it, you know, and even down to like the language of certain things that he said in dialogue or whatever. But I think being such a stickler about that is why you created Pike and I created Anya, to give like the book some air, you know, like to create like an imaginative space where we could play, you know, and I mean, we can play within what we know of the real people, but it's nothing like playing with these completely made up characters. And like the play that I did with her, like, inspired me to be really a stickler with the others, and vice versa, you know? So.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. And for me, Pike is very, very talky, like he's very voicey rather. He has kind of a strong voice that it would have been difficult to give to Georgie. Yeah.
Well, I think we're at 20 up. So if there are like questions from the audience, I would love, a big long question. That's exciting. Do you want, Alice, can you see that question, or do you want me to read it?
Shall I read it out? Or
Yes.
Okay. It says, Alice, I'm wondering how you render their marriage. Do they seem to have loved one another, mainly interested in what they could gain from the other, how the other might be used? For Yeats, that would have been to help him summon spirits, which, as he said, give me metaphors from poetry. So, you know, we're quoting Yeats here, this is good. And for her, just to be with a great poet, more emotional, it said they spent their marriage night summoning spirits, not terribly romantic. So I suppose it depends on how you look at it. Anyway, how did you see their relationship, and how would you compare it with your understanding of their actual relationship, Bill? Thank you, Bill. I mean, it's tricky. A marriage is a very long thing. And I think that they really appreciated each other. I mean, I think that they had a deep relationship, deeper than just Yeats communing with spirits. I mean, I think she uses the spirits in order to reassure him that the marriage is the right thing. I think that they had quite a successful relationship for quite a while. And then something goes wrong later in their lives. I think he's very grateful to her, and she takes care of him in a way that I think is probably quite difficult and probably quite common for women and men, whether they are great or not. So I think she had a bit of a rough ride in many ways, but she respected his work, and so she did a lot. I mean, I think that they were fond of each other, but I don't think it was an easy marriage. And I could talk about it for a really long time, actually. So I think that Frank O'Connor, the Irish writer, at some point he said Yeats was very fortunate in his marriage. And I think that that is absolutely true, right? I mean, because it's not just that she summoned spirits, it's that she really influenced and directed his poetry in a way that I think was tremendously helpful. And so together they made some really great work. I mean, he made the work and she kind of directed him effectively. But yeah, I don't think it was an easy marriage. I mean, she ended up being an alcoholic and he ended up sleeping with lots of other people. And, you know, at some point he had an operation. There are many strange stories about Yeats. It was a long marriage. But yeah, I think they respected each other. And I think that's important. I think that's really pretty great. But yes, there were times when things went wrong and she said, if I had known this would happen, I never would have had children. I mean, she did have children and looked after them in a medieval tower with no running water and no electricity in the summers in Ireland. So, you know, it was a very interesting marriage, you know, it was yeah.
I wanted to ask too, if there are any, certainly if there are any other questions, please at any time, either, if you wanted to also to unmute, you could just unmute, or like maybe say in the chat, like I have a question, and then we can unmute you, and you can just ask the question directly. That also could work. But you know what you just said, Alice. Oh, I'm sorry. There you are, Zoe. Is that a hand? Okay. Let's go to. I saw Zoe's hand first, so we'll go to Zoe, and then Susan Finley had a question.
Hi. I don't know if I had a question more than a statement, but I was really interested in the fact that she was richer than him. And it seemed like there was a whole lot of things that went on, because you were describing actually the early years, really, you know, of them getting together, that he finally kind of made the sensible decision to be with this woman who wasn't beautiful or who wasn't, you know, this fantasy, but was someone who could provide a life for him. But then she ended up being this creative, or maybe she was always that, but, you know, she also helped him with his creativity. I just thought that was, I don't know what the question is. I just want to hear more about it from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, no, that's true. There is that financial element. When he first has decided to marry her, and everyone is a bit like, who even is this woman? You were just obsessed with someone else very recently. And he says, she has money, but not too much, which of course is something we should all aspire to have money, but not too much. No, but yeah, I mean, the money definitely is important. Her money does pay for the repairs and the renovations on the medieval tower, which is important if you're a poet to have a proper medieval tower. But yeah, I think it was clear that she was going to be a tremendous creative help to him, because she was, I mean, she spoke several languages, she was very well studied, she was much more rigorous than he was. I think that it was clear to both of them that they would make a wonderful team. So, yeah.
And then Susan had a question about, she says, you're someone who does a huge amount of research, of prior research, and you've lived in many different countries, but you've never lived in England. How do you think this influenced the book? For example, were you excited by the challenge? Did you want to create your England in the same way you created your Georgie or your Yeats?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I have never lived in England, it's true. Although I have worked out, it's definitely the country that I've spent the most time that I have not lived in. Did I want to create my England? No. I think if I created my England, then it would be a bit of an alarm bells for, I did get some English people to read the book because I was worried that maybe I had made some error. I mean, New Zealand is kind of in many ways like thankfully it's changing now, but for a long time it just thought of itself as a kind of little England. So you sort of end up soaked in English culture. But yeah, I mean, I wanted to create a time and place that was vivid and as close to how it had been, I suppose. Yeah, but I mean, it's a hard thing to research. Did you feel that anxiety, Chris, about Italy, or?
I mean, I had luckily spent a lot of time in Italy. My parents were born in Italy, and so I've been back and forth many times over the course of my life. And then for this book, I traveled to all the places in the book all the places in Italy where the book takes place, and did specific research and took lots of pictures and talked to people, and even took the bus route that one of the characters would have taken, and all this sort of thing, to try to really kind of inhabit the space, and also just hoping like that the space would sort of seep into me, and that I would be able to channel it somehow.
Yeah. I actually think that's the best part of writing historical fiction, is all of the retracing of the steps, like walking the route from the war hospital, like around Hyde Park to, actually I think my friend Jeff is listening, and I took him to the Order of the Golden Dawn in North Kensington, and we looked up at this building and I was like, that's where the Order of the Golden Dawn was. But I mean, it's like, it feels like it's research, but actually, well, I mean, it is research. It's genuinely research. You have to do all those things, but it's also like tremendous fun and kind of, I mean, it's too fun to be research in a way.
I know I think the most useful advice I've ever given any of my writing students was to, if you're going to write a novel, like set it someplace that you want to visit for research. Don't set it in some awful town that you don't want to spend a lot of time. So, and yeah, I mean, I wrote off all those on my taxes. There's
That's brilliant. Yeah.
So, let me see. I have a question, unless there's someone else who has a question. I was wondering if you had any, like, another question. I'm just gonna like throw out all the questions that everyone asked me, because I'm always, because again, we have similar kinds of approaches here. But one question I always get asked is, like, for lack of a better word, like, why tell this story, in the sense of, what resonance do you see it have? Or did you have an idea of like what you wanted to say about this experience of these characters that is in any way resonant or relevant with the current moment, or relationships in general, literary history? Like, I mean, you know what I mean? Like, what is there like a not a theme, but like a sort of contemporary idea that you see like working through this?
Yeah, I think there are so many. I mean, I have kind of so many answers to that question, I think, actually. And also I could talk about the present time. But one thing I would like to say is that I think that the book is really about communication. And I think that, I mean, the medium is very much like the historical novelist, right? Interpreting the words of the dead through the medium to the readers, or, and Georgie's favorite philosopher was the American philosopher William James, and he said at one point, this was the epigraph to the novel for a long time, he said, the breach between one mind and another is perhaps the greatest breach in nature. And I thought that was wonderful, not because it's telling you that between your mind and any other mind, there's this vast breach, but because it's telling you that there's this vast breach and we managed to overcome it, right? I mean, in like over Zoom in a pandemic, but that even though our methods of communication are always inevitably imperfect, they're beautiful. And I think that in what's amazing about Georgie, and what I found fantastic about her story, is that she manages to overcome this breach in a really unusual, very creative, and kind of inspiring way, although also perhaps crushing, depending on how you think about it. I mean, in a way, she gets everything she wants, but in another way, I mean, it's clearly it's a tremendous compromise that she makes. But yeah, this idea of this breach and of communication. I mean, I suppose all novels are really about either kind of the tragedy of the failure of communication, or the kind of the amazing success against the odds. So yeah, I think that is something that really drove me, and I think that that's I mean, it's something that we could say is hugely relevant now, communication, and obviously we're having tremendous problems with it. But I think we always have, and we always will. Although I do hope that the current political movement is maybe we can be optimistic about it. Maybe things will improve.
I could use a little optimism right now. Yeah, that sounds
yeah, definitely due for some.
But also, you know, what I think you're saying too is, one way I read what you're saying is just the whole question of empathy. You know, like how much we're able to not just communicate with not just communicate with someone, but fully imagine their experience that we feel as if we are experiencing it as well, you know, and how, you know, how sorely lacking empathy is in our world in general, how really it is an impossible thing. Like, actually, empathy is kind of impossible, just like what James was saying, like there's always a vast chasm between everybody, and full empathy, the idea that we could fully imagine what it's like to be another person is impossible, and yet it's what writers do in their work, and it's what we all have to do in order to just get along, to live with your partner, to live with your children, to like live with your parents, whatever it is. Like, we have to constantly live happily, I should say. We have to constantly try to see things from their perspective, you know, and that's the only way that we can really thrive. And yet it's actually something we are actually completely unable to really fully do, you know. So and then when you work in the whole question of like the afterlife and all of that stuff into it, and those kinds of communications, it's really fascinating. So it's really great.
I think we've got time for maybe just one more question. It's 5:55. If anyone has one. No one does, I do.
Go for it.
Okay. Thanks. This has been great. This has been a great conversation, guys. Thank you so much. And the readings are both just wonderful. But I had a question for you, Alice. When I was studying Yeats back years ago, the occult stuff was almost always kind of a sort of an embarrassing aside. And it seems, you know, it's like, well, there's this system of gyres. Let me explain it to you later. Within the last few years, it seems to be taking a little bit more seriously the study of the occult. And you just mentioned the Order of the Golden Dawn. Could you sort of entertain us a little bit more with some stories of some of these, what they were really up to, or what you think they were up to?
Yeah, sure. It is a very strange world, and you're right, it was kind of very unfashionable for a long time. And I mean, the Golden Dawn were magicians. And it's interesting because Georgie and Yeats, neither of them went to university, and the Order of the Golden Dawn was kind of like their university. Because they're sort of levels, and you have to do a lot of research, you have to do examinations. So it's quite an interesting idea that you can be in a spiritual order, and that can be your education. When the spirits are talking to Yeats, when the instructors are talking to Yeats through Georgie, he says, "Oh, I'm just going to dedicate my whole life to this occult system. And that's when, as Bill quoted before, that's when the instructors say, no, you know, we're here to give you metaphors for poetry. You know, the spirits are saying, no, Yeats, you need to be a poet. You don't need to write a book about these occult symbols." Yeats writes the book anyway. It's called A Vision, and it's his least read book. It's the book of all his system, which is quite mad and interesting sometimes, and also not very exciting at other times. Georgie didn't want him to do it at all, and the dedication that Yeats wanted to write, that he didn't enter this dedication, but he wanted to. It said, "To my wife, who created this system which bores her." So I think it's an odd kind of a relationship with these things. Yeah, there's a lot of kind of daggers and robes and symbols, and it's quite dramatic. And there's also a lot of secrecy, so you actually don't know what happened in a lot of the order rites, because it was top secret. But yeah, I mean, it's quite fascinating. There's more of it in the book. But yeah, shall I? Oh.
Thank you so much. This has been absolutely fascinating, but I think we are just about out of time. We do have one last comment from Bill in the chat, which I could read out if people would like. He says, on the problem of communication, knowing another mind, I think we only imagine we have complete communication with an understanding of our own mind. So it may not be very different trying to know another's.
Very good.
Great insight.
There's another key issue with the whole issue of communication, how we end up articulating, totally misunderstanding our needs and desires. Yeah, that's definitely a part of the whole chaotic business. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for this. It's been really, really lovely, and it's lovely to meet you, Chris, and also it's lovely to have met your beautiful book and all of its precise, elegant sentences. And yeah, thank you so much, Rachel and David, for having us. And yeah, that's my...
Thanks very much. Thanks a lot, both of you.
Thank you. This has been a great night. We really appreciate you all coming out.
And we'll see you next week. We have more great Northshire Lives next week with a super busy week. So come on back and we'll see you then. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Buy Alice's book right now. Buy it.
Take care, guys.
This book.